If I told you there's a potato-like food growing completely free across large parts of America, sweeter than most. Store-bought. Sweet potatoes more resilient than anything in the produce aisle and ignored so thoroughly that people mow it down or spray it with herbicide. You'd probably assume this is one of those internet exaggerations. I get it, I've seen the hype waves too. But this isn't a trend, and it's not a rediscovered superfood with a price tag slapped on it. This is a piece of forgotten American food knowledge that never needed marketing to begin with. And once you understand what this plant actually is, and what it isn't, you'll never look at grocery store sweet potatoes the same way again. Most people have never heard of wild sweet potato or wild yam growing feral in the United States, even though versions of Dioscorea and Ipomoea species have been quietly doing their thing here for generations. They don't show up in glossy cookbooks. They're not trending on wellness blogs, and that's exactly why they matter. Because long before food became branding, these plants fed people who didn't have the luxury of choosing between organic labels. They survived droughts, neglect, poor soil, and complete indifference, and they still do. That alone should tell you something. Here is the part that usually makes people uncomfortable. The sweet potatoes you buy in stores today are optimized for shipping, uniformity, and shelf life, not resilience or flavor depth. Anyone who's grown or foraged long enough knows this pattern. Flavor gets sacrificed first, diversity second, and nutrition slowly follows. Wild forms don't play by those rules. They never had to. They evolved to survive, not to look good under fluorescent lighting. And when you dig one up, if you know what you're redoing, you're retasting something closer to what humans actually relied on for thousands of years. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, let's get something straight early. Not every wild yam or wild sweet potato is edible without proper identification and preparation. Some Dioscorea species require processing. Some are bitter. Some are downright unpleasant if treated like grocery produce. This is exactly why most people either dismiss them or romanticize them incorrectly. I've tested this myself. I've seen people mess this up. And that is why this video isn't about fantasy survival stories. It is about real-world knowledge that got lost when convenience took over. What makes these plants fascinating isn't just that they're edible. It's how they grow. Wild Ipomoea species, cousins of cultivated sweet potatoes, don't ask permission. They sprawl, climb, and root where nothing else wants to. Cracked lots, fence lines, abandoned land, areas people assume are dead ground. That alone tells you how fragile modern food systems really are by comparison. Meanwhile, wild Dioscorea species send energy underground, building dense tubers that don't care if you forget about them for a year or two. You can't say that about most store varieties. Here is something most people don't realize until they actually compare them side by side. Wild tubers tend to have more complex sweetness. Not candy sweet in the artificial sense, but layered, earthy, nutty, sometimes almost chestnut-like once cooked properly. Store-bought sweet potatoes are predictable. Wild ones aren't. That unpredictability scares industrial food systems. But it's exactly what kept humans alive when monocrops failed. And let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how every ancient superfood suddenly needs a brand, a powder, and a subscription model? Funny how that works. Meanwhile, plants like this are literally growing for free, completely unmonetizable at scale, and therefore invisible. That's not an accident. Forgotten foods tend to stay forgotten when no one can own them. One of the biggest myths I hear is that if something were truly valuable, someone would already be selling it. That's a modern way of thinking and the wrong one. Historically, the most valuable foods were the ones that couldn't be controlled easily. Wild yams don't fit neatly into industrial agriculture. They don't grow uniformly, they don't harvest on a schedule, and they don't behave when you try to force them into rows. That makes them useless to mass production, but perfect for individuals who actually know how to read the land. I've talked to old foragers, gardeners, and people whose grandparents lived through times when grocery stores weren't guaranteed. The stories are consistent. These plants were known. They were used quietly. And then they were forgotten, not because they stopped working, but because we stopped needing to know. Convenience replaced competence. That trade-off always comes due eventually. Now here's where things get interesting and controversial. In blind taste tests I've done personally, prepared correctly, wild tubers often outperform cheap store-bought sweet potatoes in depth of flavor, not always in size, not always in consistency, but in character. And character matters more than people realize. It's the difference between food that fills you and food that teaches you something. If you're still with me, drop a comment and tell me this. Have you ever eaten something wild that completely changed how you looked at store-bought food afterward? Because once that switch flips, it doesn't flip back. The biggest mistake beginners make is assuming wild food is inferior because it is smaller or less polished. That's backwards. Wild plants invest energy where it matters, survival and nutrient density, not appearance. Anyone who's grown heirloom crops knows this pattern well. The prettiest produce is rarely the best tasting. And this is where the candy potato nickname actually makes sense. When prepared the right way, slow-cooked, roasted, or even fermented, some wild Ipomoea tubers develop a natural sweetness that feels earned, not engineered. It's not sugar bomb sweet, it's balanced. It's satisfying. And it doesn't leave you chasing the next bite the way processed carbs do. If you want to go deeper, I'll eventually break down identification differences between Dioscorea and Ipomoea, safe handling principles, and why misidentification is the real reason these plants get a bad reputation. Not because they're dangerous, but because people rush them. This is slow knowledge. And slow knowledge doesn't trend. Here as a truth bomb, most channels want to say out loud. Modern people aren't too disconnected from nature because nature disappeared. They're disconnected because the knowledge pipeline was cut. Plants like this expose that gap instantly. They force you to pay attention, to learn, to remember. And before we go further, let me throw this out there. If this kind of forgotten food knowledge matters to you, hit like and subscribe. Not because it helps me, but because it tells the algorithm that this kind of content deserves oxygen. The more people who remember these things, the harder they are to erase again. One of the most effective ways a food disappears isn't by banning it, but by rebranding it as worthless. That's exactly what happened to wild yams and wild sweet potato relatives in America. Once a plant is labeled a weed, people stop asking questions. They stop tasting it. They stop teaching their kids about it. And within a couple of generations, something that once fed entire communities becomes invisible, not extinct, just ignored. That distinction matters more than people realize. If you trace early American settlement records, especially in the Southeast and parts of the Midwest, references to wild tubers show up constantly. Not as novelties but as fallback foods. Foods you relied on when crops failed, when supply lines broke, or when you simply didn't have the luxury of choice. Indigenous groups knew these plants intimately. Not just how to harvest them, but when to leave them alone. How to process them safely, and how to ensure they kept coming back year after year. That kind of relationship doesn't develop accidentally. It comes from generations of trial, error, and respect for the land. What's rarely mentioned is how early European settlers adopted this knowledge quietly. They didn't write cookbooks about it. They didn't market it. They used it when they had to. And then, as agriculture industrialized and food systems centralized, that knowledge stopped being passed down. Not because it stopped working, but because it stopped being convenient. You can draw a straight line from that shift to where we are now, a culture that panics at the idea of food, shortages while mowing down edible plants without a second thought. Wild Dioscorea species, in particular, tell a brutal truth about resilience. These plants don't just survive neglect, they thrive on it. Their underground tubers act like energy vaults, storing calories year after year. I've personally dug specimens that were clearly multiple seasons old, untouched, waiting. That's not a design flaw. That's a survival strategy. Compare that to modern crops that collapse without irrigation schedules, fertilizers, and pest control, and you start to understand why these plants were never meant to disappear, only to be forgotten. And here's where things get uncomfortable for modern food narratives. The idea that progress always means better food is demonstrably false. We gained consistency and lost adaptability. We gained scale and lost redundancy. Wild food systems don't fail all at once. Industrial ones do. That's not theory, that's history repeating itself over and over. Now, let's talk about taste honestly, because this is where people either romanticize or dismiss wild foods completely. Wild tubers are not interchangeable with grocery store sweet potatoes. They're not meant to be. Some are starchier. Some are drier. Some need longer cooking times. Some need processing to remove bitterness. That doesn't make them inferior. It makes them real. The biggest mistake people make is expecting wild food to behave like domesticated food. That's like expecting a working dog to act like a show dog. Different purpose, different strengths. When prepared correctly, the payoff is depth. Not the blunt sweetness engineered into modern varieties, but something layered. And more importantly, something that actually satisfies. I've noticed, and this comes from years of testing, that people tend to eat less when they eat wild, nutrient-dense starches. Not because they're restricting themselves, but because their body gets what it needs faster. That's not a miracle claim. That's basic nutrition and satiety at work. Let me pause here and ask you something real. Have you ever bought a food because everyone hyped it up only to realize later it was just aggressively marketed mediocrity? Drop that story in the comments. I read them, and trust me, you're not alone. One reason wild yams scare people is because they require judgment. There's no label, no instructions, no refund policy. You have to slow down, learn, pay attention. And modern culture is deeply uncomfortable with that. It is easier to declare something unsafe than to admit we lost the skills to use it properly. That's not an insult, it's an observation. Skill loss always masquerades as danger. This is also why misinformation spreads so easily around these plants. You'll hear claims that all wild yams are poisonous, or that they're not worth the effort, or that they're starvation food. Those statements usually come from people who've never actually spent time with the plant. Real foragers don't talk like that. They talk in specifics, species, preparation, timing, context. Blanket statements are a dead giveaway of inexperience. And timing matters more than most people realize. Harvesting wild tubers at the wrong time can give you a completely false impression of the plant. Too early, and you'll think it's weak or flavorless. Too late, and you might struggle with texture. This isn't plug-and-play food, it's seasonal knowledge. And that knowledge used to be common. Another overlooked detail is how these plants regenerate. Many wild yams can be harvested in ways that don't destroy the plant entirely. That's a radically different mindset from modern agriculture, which treats land like something to extract from, not collaborate with. Once you understand that, the plant stops being free food and starts being a relationship. And yes, that sounds old-fashioned because it is. Old-fashioned doesn't mean outdated. It means tested longer than our current systems have even existed. If this is already changing how you think about weeds, you're exactly where you should be. One of the quiet disasters in American food culture is that we stopped caring about accurate names. That might sound trivial, but it's not. The confusion between yams and sweet potatoes didn't just mess up grocery store signage. It erased entire categories of food knowledge. When people can't name a thing correctly, they stop seeing it clearly. And wild varieties were the first casualties of that confusion. In the United States, what most people call a yam in the grocery store is almost always a sweet potato, specifically Ipomoea batatas. True yams belong to the Dioscorea genus, and for the most part, they don't show up in mainstream American supermarkets at all. That naming mistake started decades ago as a marketing move. Softer, sweeter varieties sold better when called yams, and it stuck, but the side effect was massive. People stopped understanding that there were wild relatives, distinct species, and entire food traditions tied to both groups. Once everything became just a sweet potato, wild Ipomoea species lost their identity. Once true Dioscorea disappeared from shelves, wild yams became mythologized or feared, and fear is a powerful eraser. I've watched people step over edible plants because someone once told them, "Those are poisonous." No species, no context. Just a sentence passed down like a curse. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Ignorance spreads faster than knowledge because it is easier to repeat. Proper identification takes effort. Preparation takes patience. And neither fits neatly into a culture built on speed. When you actually take the time to learn the differences, patterns emerge. Wild Ipomoea vines often resemble their cultivated cousins more than people expect. The leaves may vary in shape, the tubers in size, but the lineage is there. Wild Dioscorea, on the other hand, behaves differently. More climbing, more fibrous vines, more emphasis on underground storage. Once you've seen both in the field, the confusion disappears, but you have to see them. Reading alone won't do it. This is where modern content fails people. Quick lists, oversimplified warnings, no nuance. That's how knowledge dies. Real understanding lives in the gray area, the part that doesn't fit into a 30-second clip. Another reason these plants fell out of favor is that they don't reward impatience. Wild tubers don't grow to cartoonish sizes in a single season. They don't give you instant gratification. They reward consistency, observation, long-term thinking. That's the opposite of modern food culture. And again, that's not a moral judgment. It's a mismatch of values. Let me tell you something I learned the hard way. The first time I harvested a wild yam, I did everything wrong. Wrong timing, wrong preparation, wrong expectations. And I almost wrote the plan off entirely. If I had stopped there, I'd be repeating the same bad information you hear everywhere. Instead, I paid attention, adjusted, tried again. And the difference wasn't subtle, it was night and day. That's how real expertise forms. Not from one success, and not from one failure, but from staying curious long enough to see patterns. This is also why older generations rarely bragged about this knowledge. It wasn't about showing off. It was about survival. You don't sensationalize what you depend on. You just use it. Quietly, reliably. And when those generations passed, so did the habit of quiet competence. If you're finding this eye-opening, do me a favor and share this video with someone who still thinks food only comes from stores. Not to prove a point, but to reopen a conversation we shouldn't have let die. Now, let's address the beat store-bought claim head-on, because this is where people either lean in or click away. Wild doesn't automatically mean better. Anyone telling you that is selling a fantasy. What wild does mean is different priorities. Store-bought sweet potatoes are bred for yield, uniformity, and transport durability. Wild tubers are selected by environment. That selection process favors nutrient density, resilience, and adaptability. Over time, those traits compound. When you compare cheap, mass-produced sweet potatoes to well-prepared wild tubers, especially in terms of satiety and flavor complexity, the difference is real, not universal, not guaranteed, but real enough that anyone who has tested both, honestly, will tell you there's something missing in the modern version. That something is diversity, genetic, culinary, and cultural. Here is a question worth sitting with. How many foods do you eat today that would survive without constant human intervention? Not many. Wild yams would. And that alone puts them in a different category entirely. At some point, the language around land shifted. Plants were no longer described by what they provided, but by whether they were supposed to be there. That's when terms like invasive, nuisance, and undesirable started doing heavy cultural work. And while invasive species management is a real ecological concern in some cases, that language has been applied far too broadly, especially to edible plants that don't fit modern land use plans. Wild yams and wild sweet potato relatives got caught in that crossfire. Vining plants that spread aggressively? Must be a problem. Tubers that don't align with crop schedules? Useless. And once those labels stick, people stop asking the most important question of all. Does this plant feed people? Historically, that was the first question. Today, it's often the last, if it's asked at all. What's ironic is that many of these plants didn't invade anything. They filled niches humans created: disturbed soil, abandoned land, fence rows, roadsides, places where native systems were already broken. In ecological terms, they're responders, not aggressors. But nuance doesn't survive policy language very well. And nuance definitely doesn't survive mowing schedules. Once a plant is officially categorized as a problem, knowledge about it becomes inconvenient. Schools don't teach it, extension services ignore it. And younger generations grow up assuming the absence of information means absence of value. That is how edible landscapes turn into blank spaces mentally, even when they re-physically everywhere. I've watched people spray herbicide on vines that their great-grandparents might have relied on during hard years. Not out of malice, out of ignorance. And that's the part that stings. Forgetting doesn't usually look dramatic. It looks normal. This is also where the food system and land management quietly align. A population that doesn't recognize edible plants is a population that depends entirely on centralized supply. That dependency doesn't require conspiracy. It's just a byproduct of specialization, but it does have consequences. When knowledge collapses, options collapse with it. And let's be honest, wild yams don't fit neatly into environmental narratives either. They're not charismatic. They don't photograph well. They don't have a PR team. They don't show instant results. So they fall through the cracks. Meanwhile, people chase imported superfoods grown halfway across the world, while edible calories grow untended at their feet. If this is making you rethink what you've been taught to ignore, that's the point. Now let's talk about something practical. Why these plants survived when so many others disappeared. Resilience isn't luck. It's strategy. Wild tubers survive because they operate on a different timeline. Above ground, they might look fragile. Underground, they're patient. When conditions are bad, they wait. When conditions improve, they respond. That's not just impressive, it's instructive. Modern agriculture stripped that patience out of food. Crops are expected to perform on demand. Wild plants refuse. And that refusal is their power. They don't burn themselves out chasing one good season. They think in decades. This is also why people underestimate them nutritionally. Lab tests tend to favor standardized samples. Wild foods vary. One plant might be average. Another might be exceptional. That variability scares systems built on predictability. But for individuals, variability is insurance. Diversity protects you from failure. I've seen foragers dismiss wild yams because they're not worth the calories. That's a misunderstanding of how food works outside spreadsheets. Calories aren't the only metric. Micronutrients, fiber structure, glycemic response, satiety, all of that matters. And wild tubers often punch above their weight in those areas, especially when compared to cheap, mass-produced starches. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you ate a food that made you feel genuinely grounded afterward? Not full, grounded. That's a feeling people used to recognize. Wild foods tend to bring it back. Another uncomfortable truth is that reclaiming this knowledge requires humility. You have to accept that people before us knew things we don't. That doesn't sit well in a culture obsessed with progress. But progress without memory isn't progress, it's amnesia with better tools. Preparation is where most people lose the plot. Not because wild yams are difficult, but because modern cooking habits are built around convenience, not understanding. When people say they tried wild tubers and didn't like them, 9 times out of 10 what they really mean is they treated them like store-bought produce and expected the same result. That's not experimentation, that's assumption. And wild food punishes assumptions quickly. It was about principles, timing, heat, patience, and most importantly, respect for what the plant actually is. Some Dioscorea species were soaked. Some were dried first. Some were cooked long and slow. Those methods didn't come from superstition. They came from generations of people paying attention to cause and effect, remove bitterness, improve digestibility, unlock flavor. Simple goals refined over time. What modern shortcuts often do is skip the problem-solving step entirely. People rush wild tubers, get bitterness or poor texture, and assume the plant is the problem. That's backwards. It's like blaming a tool because you don't know how to use it yet. Real learning starts when you assume the system makes sense, even if you don't understand it yet. One of the most overlooked aspects of wild tubers is texture management. Store-bought sweet potatoes are bred to be forgiving. Overcook them and they're still edible. Undercook them and they're still sweet. Wild tubers don't offer that safety net. They demand precision. But when you get it right, the payoff is something store-bought versions rarely deliver: structure, a satisfying bite, a sense that you're eating food, not filler. And here's something that surprises people. Wild doesn't mean primitive. Some of the most sophisticated food techniques humans ever developed were designed specifically to work with wild plants. Fermentation, drying, slow roasting, ash cooking. These weren't last resorts, they were optimizations. Modern food culture treats these methods like trends. Historically, they were how you made hard foods excellent. There's also an emotional component people don't talk about enough. When you invest time in preparing something properly, your relationship to it changes. You eat slower. You notice more. You waste less. That shift alone alters how food affects you. Wild yams force that shift whether you want it or not. And for a lot of people, that's deeply uncomfortable because it breaks the illusion that convenience is neutral. Let me share a pattern I've seen repeatedly. People who stick with wild foods long enough stop craving hyper-processed sweetness. Not because they're restricting themselves, but because their palate recalibrates. Subtle sweetness becomes enough. Depth replaces intensity. That doesn't happen overnight. It happens when your body stops being bombarded with engineered extremes. If you've ever wondered why food used to feel more satisfying, even when portions were smaller, this is part of the answer. Another reason these plants fell out of favor is that they don't fit into modern cooking content. You can't just flash a before and after shot and call it a day. The story matters. The process matters. And that doesn't perform well in a culture addicted to shortcuts. But it performs incredibly well in real life, where results matter more than clicks. Now, let's talk about safety, calmly, clearly, without fear-mongering. Some wild yams contain compounds that need to be reduced through proper preparation. This isn't unique. Cassava does, acorns do, even kidney beans do. The difference is we normalized safe preparation for some foods and abandoned it for others. That abandonment gets reframed as danger when it's really just neglect. Knowledge didn't disappear because it was unsafe. It disappeared because it was inconvenient. Here's a mental shift that changes everything. Instead of asking, is this plant edible? Ask, how did people make this plant edible? That question assumes success is possible. And historically, it usually was. If you're getting value from this, leave a comment and tell me what plant you've always wondered about, but never learned how to use. There are no dumb questions here, only forgotten answers. Modern nutrition science likes clean data. Controlled samples, predictable inputs, repeatable outputs. Wild foods don't cooperate with that framework very well, and wild yams are a perfect example. When researchers analyze cultivated crops, they're often testing a narrow genetic slice grown under standardized conditions. Wild plants don't offer that luxury. Two tubers from the same patch can differ based on soil, rainfall, age, and stress. From a lab perspective, that's a nightmare. From a survival and resilience perspective, it's a strength. This is why you'll often see wild foods dismissed as nutritionally inconsistent. That's technically true and practically misleading. Inconsistency is a problem only if your system depends on uniformity. Traditional food systems didn't. They depended on redundancy and diversity. If one plant underperformed, another picked up the slack. Modern systems concentrate risk. Wild systems distribute it. Another blind spot in modern nutrition is that numbers don't tell the whole story. Calorie counts don't capture satiety. Vitamin percentages don't explain bioavailability. Fiber isn't just fiber, its structure matters. Wild tubers often digest differently than cultivated ones, releasing energy more slowly and steadily. People feel this before they can measure it. And because it's hard to quantify, it gets ignored. That's one reason you rarely hear people say wild yams are life-changing, but you'll hear them say things like, I didn't get hungry as fast, or I felt more stable afterward. Those aren't marketing claims, they're observations. And historically, observation was how food knowledge advanced long before anyone had a lab coat. This brings us back to the central idea of this entire video. Forgotten doesn't mean obsolete. It means displaced. Wild sweet potatoes and wild yams didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because we built a system that didn't need them, until it does again. The candy potato growing free across America isn't magic. It's not perfect. It's not always convenient, but it's honest food. Food that reflects the land it grows in. Food that demands attention instead of branding. And food that quietly proves a point modern culture hates admitting. Abundance doesn't always come from stores. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. The most valuable food knowledge we lost wasn't recipes. It was judgment. Knowing when something was ready. Knowing how to adapt when it wasn't. Knowing the difference between danger and unfamiliarity. So no, this isn't about replacing grocery stores or romanticizing the past. It's about remembering that we once knew how to feed ourselves without permission, packaging, or panic. And that knowledge is still here, growing quietly, waiting for people curious enough to notice it again.